Welcome to Zero. I am Akshat Rathi. This week, imagining utopia in 2025. I love reading science fiction, and one of the sci-fi writers who has had an impact on me in recent years is Kim Stanley Robinson. Stan is perhaps best known for his Mars trilogy published in the 1990s, but Zero listeners are likely to know him for his writings over the past decade on what climate futures here on Earth might look like. Be it the underwater metropolis he imagined in his novel New York 2140, or how a United Nations agency and its dark wing of eco-terrorists tackle the climate crisis in his book The Ministry for the Future. Stan has been a guest on Zero before, but I wanted to speak with him again because that book, The Ministry for the Future, has been on my mind recently. Although it was published in 2020, the story in the book kicks off in the year 2025. And well, here we are. The book opens just after a fictional COP29 summit as a deadly heatwave hits India. The plot follows the choices faced by United Nations officials in a new department called the Ministry for the Future, as they try to cope with the spiraling impacts of a warming planet. With 2025 upon us, I wanted to see how Stan was feeling about the book's version of this timeline, and find out what he thought about the unpredictable direction real-life events have taken since he wrote it. We talked about the value of science fiction as a way to see into the future, as well as sci-fi's dangers, and why a writer who admires science and technology so much still remains enamored with the unglamorous work of a body like the UN. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Akshat. It's good to be back.
So I listened to our conversation from a couple of years ago, and I have to say you sounded optimistic. And in 2023, there were good reasons to be optimistic. We talked about how after the Paris Agreement, when the world was headed towards maybe 4 or 5 degrees Celsius of warming, we had these forces come together, including the US turning around and having a climate law passed. And there was a general sense of coherence in the world trying to do something about climate change at a scale, finally. So now here we are, sitting at the start of 2025, the exact time period when the Ministry for the Future sort of gets started on its journey. And I thought it might be interesting to just revisit and update our outlooks of where we are, sort of a check-in. We are in the future you were imagining. Today, it is here. How are you feeling?
Well, I want to say first that you're in a better position to judge the situation than I am, given your work and that you're talking to everybody. And I'd be very interested to hear your impressions. As for me, here in Davis, California, just looking out at the world, I have this sense that everything is accelerating. And that was already true in 2022. I had realized that the dates that I had put in Ministry for the Future were all wrong, and that I had set things out happening in the far future of a few decades from now that were going to happen one way or another in the 2020s. So the acceleration seems to still be speeding up. And I mean by this both bad things and good things. And I suppose I should address what looks to be the big reversal, which is the unexpected re-election of Donald Trump. At least it wasn't expected by me. I had it called exactly backwards, and I'm still shocked and dismayed. But I'll point out that my novel, Ministry for the Future, was written during Trump years. I was very angry then, and it postulated a world in which the United States was not a major player in dealing with climate change. It was really the other nations of the world driving the process out of necessity, and the United States being a somewhat big, rich kid, a narcissistic child in the background being dragged along into the adult world of reality. And maybe that's again, a little bit true. But a lot of things happened between 2020 and 2024 that are now path dependent in their own good way. The good things have been speeding up as well as the bad things. It's simply cheaper to build new clean energy than old dirty energy. And this is crucial in a capitalist world, that every source of investment that isn't government is looking for some kind of highest rate of return. And if there is a higher rate of return that can come to doing a green project rather than a dirty project, then it will get done. So some guardrails have changed a little. The IRA bill that the Biden administration got passed was very important because it shows that it's not just a matter of carbon quantitative easing, of the central banks and the governments cooking up new money, which I think is important and really needs to happen, but also simply legislation, that legislatures of the world, when they vote in climate action, economic activities, and investments in private businesses in their nation states, that good things can happen and that they multiply.
I think you're right in that, yes, clean energy has become cheaper than dirty energy, and that fact has sunk in. But there are ways in which dirty energy is made cheaper artificially to keep its life going. And we're going to see a lot more of that. But I just wanted to come back to the ministry because to me, it is a good framework to start from. The climate problem is a problem created of inequality. And there is no way to solve it without bringing more equality to bear on the planet. That is in the form of wealth transfer, in technology transfer, in creating a carbon space for developing countries to use. And COP meetings are the place where that conversation around inequality comes to bear. And the Ministry for the Future is created through the COP framework as you imagined it. And you've been a regular listener of this show, and I'm guessing you've followed the coverage of what happened at COP29. How do you think this year's COP stacks up against what you imagine COPs to be doing?
Well, it's pretty in line with the previous COPs and with what I portrayed in my book, which is a process that is, you might call necessary but not sufficient, or a set of public promises in a society of the spectacle where at least it gets discussed every year in a way that the world pays attention to. So I still think the COP process is crucial, but it's not enough because it's built on a consensus model. So it's necessarily glacially slow. So necessary but not sufficient. And the other things have to happen that we're all doing in individual nation states and in the internationally, just in terms of trade and international relations that are more tangible than the promises made at COP. And there, good things can happen. Now, I want to point out that in my Ministry for the Future, it starts as a tiny little functionary agency that is trying to rally year-round support to get COP promises adhered to. And in a way, it's kind of an invention that creates a point of view for a novel that is legible in that there's characters with a plot. But at the same time, last September, the UN, out of the Secretary General's office, issued a pact for the future during their Summit of the Future, which was their name for Climate Week last September. And they're planning on appointing an envoy for the future. So,
that sounds a lot like the Ministry for the Future run by the UN in your book. So did the book inspire this pact?
Yes, they tell me that it did. They read it, they thought, oh, what a good idea. And I have to say that the UN story is weirdly, in some senses, the secret masters of the universe in their black helicopters and ultra powerful. And then also at the same time, and maybe more accurately, another place of promises where all the nation states go to talk to each other without any power in particular of its own. The UN has a lot of consensus, but it also has the post-World War II structure that means that it is not a gigantically effective agency. So a novel that says, oh my gosh, we got something done in the world by something coming out of the UN, naturally, my novel is popular there amongst those young diplomats. And they're feeling like the world is spinning out of their control, like all of us feel. They're doing the best that they can, and they think this is maybe one tool to focus on the future, to focus on the narrative of the member states, nation states becoming member states in something larger that manages to cope successfully with climate change. So, yes, by telling that story from that point of view, I have inspired that particular group of people.
And fiction does have real consequences. We talked about some of them in our last conversation. Another one that happened is that Oxford University launched the Ministry for the Future at Hartford College. There's supposed to be some real life efforts being put underneath that. What do you hope those can accomplish?
Well, it's a wonderful thing for me to see because Oxford is a very powerful collection of smart and energetic people who are very devoted to the cause of trying to help the world. So an Oxford Ministry for the Future is kind of a gathering space. It's not quite a research center, not quite a think tank, a series of public events. And what I hope is that it will workshop ideas for how to create a new political economy that's adequate to coping with climate change. So they want it to be a place of public outreach, of changing hearts and minds, of explaining the story, of organizing the narrative and repeating it over and over again. It's not exactly a collaboration, but I am a sort of senior advisor, instantly emeritus. I'm hoping to push to make sure that we make it something that is of interest to the audiences who come to it or hear about it.
So as a science nerd, I have always seen technology growth as a way to imagine futures, not just near futures, but long futures. And that's why I love reading science fiction. That's why I love reading the work you've put out over the years. But there is a side of me as a journalist who's sort of focused on the now, who's to think about the near future because that's my job, that I'm noticing. Maybe it is politics, maybe it is social media, maybe it is the way we consume media in general, that we as a people are imagining the future less and less, or we are imagining the future much nearer, that our horizons are not as far as they used to be. Is that a perception that is accurate, or is it just in my mind?
I think climate change since the pandemic is at least 10 times more prominent in everybody's minds, the world mind, than it was before. If a pandemic can punch us in the nose, kill 1 out of every 1,000 persons, and that's a success because it could have been far worse, but we organized quickly to make up these vaccines. Climate change could do that and make it even worse. It's the polycrisis, as Adam Tooze calls it. All of the crises of pollution, of pandemics coming out of the natural world, and then also the various political complications of our own making. So there's a polycrisis. Well, I feel like attention to that in the 2020s is such that the farther futures are, and this is finally getting to answering your questions, you don't think about, oh, what will happen when we go to the stars, which is always impossible. You don't even think about, oh, what about the greatness that will happen when we all live 250 years and it's the year 2400? Who can think that when we are having trouble thinking our way through the 21st century? So science fiction has collapsed to near future science fiction, is one way to call it.
And that difficulty of having sort of the world mind or so many pieces of information held together to try and make sense of the moment often collapses for individuals in sort of the vibe, the emotion that is driving you. And one that I think can be classed as the emotion of 2025 is we are starting off on a bleak note. So is there a way, if I were to force you to imagine a utopia, because I know you do that sometimes, for 2025, what could it be?
Interesting question. And I think it's possible. There will be a realization that you can't count on the leadership of the United States. And I mean by that, the leadership of the United States in the world, but also the leadership of the United States in terms of the incoming administration, which is looking to be a kind of clown show. What would be the utopian story is how There's always been idiots at the top of the system. And the governments of the world, the bureaucrats, the technocrats, the scientists, the teachers, society is resilient. Civil society is real. The ways in which we help each other out in daily life transcend fools at the top shouting and trying to wreck the system. So we have a soap opera, but is the soap opera actually wreaking the damage that it pretends that it wants to wreak? Everybody actually wants their daily life to continue as best it can in a positive direction. Everybody's stressed out. Everybody's in the precariat. The last thing you need is for the soap opera at the top to actually be meaningful. And if life goes on for everybody in their ordinary daily existence, substantially the same because of the path dependencies of all of our systems and the kind of resiliency of civil society, that in itself will be a victory. And I'm not saying it's a sure thing by any means. This is sort of an experiment in how strong is the American system if there is a group at the top trying to wreck it, deliberately trying to wreck it. We'll see. We are in a corrupt political system, and there's huge challenges to democracy. On the other hand, votes are still votes, and it's not entirely possible to buy them. So it's a mix, right? You can't actually give up. You can't actually start celebrating. The 2020s were always going to be a kind of crux in human history, and they still are. And it might be that the crux goes on for a decade longer than that. It's not at all inevitable that things are going to be all right, given the tendency of the forces of disorder rising. But the situation is not impossible either. And I guess, is that the utopian statement? The good result is not impossible yet.
We've sort of talked about some of the things that are big in front of our minds and on the front pages of headlines, but there are also smaller things that could become big that I would like to touch on. So one that I know both you and I have been interested in is Colombia's efforts to try and move away from fossil fuels. Now, Colombia extracts coal and oil and gas, and its economy has been dependent on it for quite some time. But it is the first sort of big, and it's not very big, but it's still a big-ish producer of fossil fuels that has signed up to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. We had Minister Susanna Mohammed, who has the Environment Ministry under her, talk on this podcast. And I know you've been thinking about how this is going to play out. You wrote to me after listening to that episode. So when you try and imagine a future where a country has to build its entire economy anew to move away from the old stuff because the old stuff just can't continue at current pace, how do you think that happens?
Well, thank you for that. I'm really interested in it. The petrostates, those nations that depend on more than 50% of their income on selling their fossil fuels, they have also signed the Paris Agreement, and so they're in a double bind. They are, on the one hand, promising to stop selling fossil fuels. On the other hand, that will bankrupt them, and they could become failed states. And we're talking about well more than 1 billion people, these petrostates. What happens then? We can't afford in social senses to have failed states left, right, and center. They need help. How could it come? Well, there's the Loss and Damage Fund, there's the Paris Agreement itself, and this Fossil Fuels Non-Proliferation Treaty is really important as a framework that if a nation like Colombia, who is a great example, because they're the 5th biggest coal producer on Earth, if they say, we want to stop, help us, help needs to come. So at that point, you need a system that is arranged sort of like the COP process's loss and damage, or like the International Monetary Fund's special drawing rights, which is a mechanism to help countries that are in trouble in paying their debts to get them the money that they need. And so this system would have to have these aspects of it that I've considered, and I throw it out there for others to consider. It would need to be a discounted compensation. They can't be paid as much as they would be for fossil fuels as they stand on the market now. That's like $1,600 trillion. What you would need is a discounted system. They take a haircut. Also, it would have to be amortized so that they get paid out over a century like it would have been if the fossil fuels had been burned. And then every country that signs on would be getting a steady payment that would also be entailed. You'd be signing something like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI, that already exists, just like the Fossil Fuels Non-Proliferation Treaty and the IMF Special Drawing Rights and the COP Loss and Damage Fund that $300 billion was just promised into. When a nation signed on that line, they would then have an income stream that they had promised to keep from being corrupted, and that it'd be devoted to green projects and the clean transition. And that way there would be a financial inducement for signing the Fossil Fuels Non-Proliferation Treaty, and then also the physical and financial help to make that transition possible and save these countries from falling into dysfunction by way of bankruptcy and social disorder. It seems to me it has to happen. And I've talked to people about it at OECD and in other places, other venues, other people in places of power, including the UN. And I have to say, it usually gets a cool response or a visible shudder of, oh my God, the Saudis suggested something like that, even though they're rich as Croesus, etc. Well, none of the past is really relevant now in this respect. We've got 75% of the fossil fuels on this earth owned by nation states that have governments that are responsible to their people. An accommodation simply must be made. And when the question then follows, oh, well, where could that much money come from? You just answer quantitative easing. You point to 2008, you point to 2020 at the start of the pandemic. Trillions were generated, I'm going to say out of thin air, because the mechanisms involved are complicated. But in fact, federal governments, central banks make up new money all the time. The money can be made, and I'll end with this. John Maynard Keynes, really the most important economist for our current moment, I would say, anything that we have to do, we can afford to do.
After the break, more of my conversation with sci-fi writer Kim Stanley Robinson. And by the way, if you've been enjoying this episode, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It helps other listeners find the show. Well, there is a yearning in the politics today of the past, of a period where, I don't know, gender, racial, wealth hierarchies were enforced. And it feels contradictory to me because, if I were to be born anytime in history and I had the choice, I would be born today because it's a pretty good time to be born. You have a whole set of diseases that we know how to defeat. You have the ability to be able to travel across continents. You have the ability to be able to speak to anybody in any corner of the world for almost free. And yet there is this yearning for the past. How do you make sense of this yearning for the past where none of these good things existed?
Well, it's a kind of a mistake. It's nostalgia. The ache of the lost home, nostalgia in Greek. Nostalgia is a very powerful feeling. I feel it myself, but it's almost always a category error. What are you regretting? Your youth, your childhood. The world itself was just as messed up then, and as you point out, it was often in many material ways much worse than now. But you don't know that. Your lived experience is when you were younger, you were healthier, your life lay before you as a set of open possibilities or a struggle to be had. But in any case, nostalgia for the past is always a kind of delusion that one has because the future is scary individually. You're going to end up falling apart somehow and dying. So the future never looks particularly good for the individual. For the collective, you can imagine that things will go on for our descendants and that they will be in a better world. And that's the solace of being human. I myself am very much in love with science right now. I should be dead at this point. Medical science has saved me now twice. I'm very grateful. I'm very cognizant that science is a force for good, is a utopian effort in the world that is making us all of our necessities and all of our toys. And that when people are anti-science, when they speak against it, When they get sick, they'll run to a scientist. So it isn't real. It's another, not a nostalgia, but a denial of reality, that there's this collective force in the world, a group of people following a method that is enormously productive and is saving our lives and keeping us going. And who knows what it might accomplish in the future as a collective effort.
As somebody who trained in the sciences, I find it odd that most governments around the world do not have more people with training in the sciences in the cabinet of the highest level. But we might see some of that coming through in the White House this time. There's a bunch of Silicon Valley people who are, yes, investors, but have science trainings who want to come in with ideas that may seem quite dangerous. And are there dangers of sci-fi thinking that you could articulate?
Well, you got to de-strand that. There's scientists and there's engineers. So Silicon Valley is not a bunch of scientists. It's a bunch of computer programmers. They're engineers, and they've read science fiction, and they have often become rich by being lucky. And then they think they're smart. And so that crowd in power is dangerous because they can be nice people. It's suspicious as hell that 95% of them are men. That's a sign that something's wrong in that whole social world. But in any case, that crowd is not to be trusted because often politically and philosophically, they're intensely naive. They seize on one idea and then that explains everything. And because they're rich, they think they know it all. Now, I am overgeneralizing here. And in my own personal acquaintanceships with billionaires, because I am near Silicon Valley and I am a science fiction writer, I've met a few. They are very often nice guys. They are very often meaning well. They are very often Democrats rather than Republicans. So you have to go to soap opera land to get a kind of a unicorn figure like Elon Musk, who is particularly wealthy, but particularly volatile and unhelpful, you might say, in his narcissism. Not all of the Silicon Valley computer billionaires who go to Washington are going to be narcissists. A lot of them are going to be solid citizens saying, I've got more money than I need. Why don't we have progressive taxation? And also, why don't you try plan A, B, and C that we have carefully tested and it might work? So again, the technocrats, the billionaires, none of them can be trusted to be the solution. In a way, it's like saying AI will solve all problems. These are artificial intelligences, these individual humans. They're natural, but they're artificial in the sense of why are they so wealthy? The solution always comes from elsewhere, but actually it's a more collective thing, really.
Now, last question, fun question. If there was a wish that could be granted to you, it could be anything, a climate fix, some investment, a particular technology, a policy change, diplomatic breakthroughs, societal change, whatever. What would you ask for in 2025?
Wow. I mean, this is so hard. This is, I would ask for 3 more wishes to become true.
The only right answer.
Yeah, I'll go back to the political economy level because really this is Bloomberg Green. And I want to say again, thanks to Bloomberg Green. I followed it intensely through the last COP29, by far the best reporting of COP29 that I'm aware of, and just keeping people aware of the world of politics and economy, of business and government in interaction with each other. It's really crucial stuff. So at that level, I would say the European Union shows what happens when nation states become member states. And so the European Union is powerful, even though it includes many little countries that are in economic trouble, but they're part of a larger whole. They hang together. It's fractious. It's difficult. It's hard to work it, but it's a change of consciousness in that when you're a member state, you have a different financial, legal, and emotional set of circumstances that guide you. If something like the UN or the WTO or the OECD, taken seriously as if those organizations had teeth and you had to do what was agreed there because you were a member in good standing, well, that would make a huge difference. Now, who's most likely to ignore and flaunt that forever? The United States of America. The U.S. has this slim majority that lives in a fantasy of, oh, we can go it all alone. We're the best. Not the best. Can't go it alone. These fantasies hopefully will lose at the ballot box after the probably spectacularly stupid political events at the top over the next couple of years. And then maybe that would be like the last flaring out of some resentful minority that's losing its power to the world majority. Who knows? But here's my wish, that every nation state took its membership in the larger organizations dead seriously as a guide to action. And then climate change would have a chance to be solved by us.
Well, I didn't see it coming that you want the G20 to be a real power. Thank you, Stan.
Thank you, Akshat. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Zero. And now for the sound of the week. That's the sound of the trailer of a 1983 film called Endgame, which takes place in a fictional 2025. But of course, it sounds a lot like 1983, and clearly no one imagined electric vehicles would be a thing. If you like this episode, please take a moment to rate or review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Share this episode with a friend or with someone who works for the United Nations. Zero's producer is Maithili Rao. Bloomberg's head of podcasts is Sage Bauman. And head of talk is Brendan Newnham. Our theme music is composed by Wonderly. Special thanks to Siobhan Wagner, Sharon Chan, Ethan Steinberg, and Jessica Beck. I am Akshat Rathi, back soon.